Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite a todos que nos assistem do Diário do Centro do Mundo. Hoje nós temos uma convidada aqui mais do que especial, Stella Assange. Para aqueles que têm seguido o canal, vocês conhecem toda a saga para libertar o Julian Assange. Mas para aqueles que não conhecem, desde a sua criação, em 2006, o Wikileaks publica mais de 1 milhão de documentos confidenciais vazados por fontes anônimas. Mas foi em 2010 que o Wikileaks abala o Estado Profundo americano com um vídeo do assassinato collateral, mostrando como soldados americanos exterminam 2 jornalistas e atiram em civis, inclusive em crianças em Bagdá, de um helicóptero Apache, como se estivessem jogando videogame. E o que se seguiu não foi menos paradigmático. Milhares de arquivos da inteligência dos Estados Unidos revelando os crimes de guerra no Afeganistão e no Iraque, mais de 250 mil documentações diplomáticas secretas mostrando o Departamento de Estado dos Estados Unidos planejava e executava intervenções na soberania de outros países. Por causa dessas revelações, Julian Assange vem enfrentando há mais de uma década o assédio jurídico conjunto de 4 países diferentes: Estados Unidos, Suécia, Reino Unido, Equador e a escandalosa omissão australiana. Essa perseguição política através do sistema de justiça culminou-se com a acusação criminal do governo Trump contra Assange por espionagem. Hoje eu estou aqui com a Stella Assange, advogada de direitos humanos, esposa de Julian Assange, mãe do Max e do Gabriel, 2 filhos do Assange, e ela está falando pela primeira vez com o público brasileiro. É uma honra enorme ter a Stella falando aqui para o público brasileiro, principalmente nesse momento tão importante. Eu queria contar um pouco da Stella. Ela nasceu na África do Sul, cresceu em Botsuana, e até que seus pais tiveram que fugir por causa do seu papel ativo na luta contra o apartheid da África do Sul. Durante a sua juventude, a Stella morou em Lesoto, Suécia, Espanha, até vir estudar no Reino Unido, onde seu caminho colidiu com um dos eventos jornalísticos mais revolucionários do nosso tempo: a criação e as revelações do Wikileaks. A gente vai conversar com uma mulher extraordinária, vida extraordinária, sobre os seus primeiros dias, seu encontro com Julian Assange, sua história de amor com Julian e como ela participa da luta pela liberdade do Julian Assange.
Obrigada for having me. Well, my parents went to Southern Africa in 1977. My father was posted there. He's a town planner and architect. He's also an artist. But he was posted there, and my parents got married and had my brother and I during the time that they were in Botswana. So I was born in 1983 at the height of the apartheid era, and although we weren't living in South Africa, of course, this was a major kind of political reality for anyone in the vicinity. Botswana was, at the time, it's a country that was quite poor but had just discovered diamonds, and the capital, Gaborone, is just a few kilometers away from the South African border. And my parents, finding like-minded people, interesting people, then quickly got into contact with artists and political activists that were fleeing South Africa and the apartheid regime. These were artists, writers, intellectuals who were leaving. And together they formed art ensemble that was a political art ensemble called Medu. And they had newsletters and posters and writings and conferences. And it became a hub of political activism right on the border of South Africa. My parents were part of this ensemble from 1978 when it was formed until 1985. And that's when it all came to an abrupt end. I was only 2.5 years old. Executed a number of members of the group, of this political artistic group, including a very close friend of our families who had been living with us for over 2 years. And this was I think a major couple of weeks after this happened. my parents had experienced intimidation by South African police for years. My parents experienced a lot of intimidation in the lead up to this raid, being interrogated at the border, being shown maps, asked about showing their house on the map, or asking them questions about who their friends were, and this kind of thing. Cars parked in the middle of the night with people inside them to intimidate just outside the house, this kind of thing. This period, although it was when I was just a baby, basically, it has really informed my worldview. We left Botswana and moved to Lesotho, where I lived until I was 7.5, started school there and so on.
A Stella me contou pouco sobre a vida dela. Ela nasce, os pais dela vão para a África do Sul para tê-la, mas os pais dela moram em Botsuana. Eles mudam para lá em 1977. O pai dela é arquiteto e artista, e a mãe dela também é diretora de teatro. E ela nasce em Botsuana em 1983, que era o ápice do regime de apartheid na África do Sul. E ela falou que era uma realidade política que envolvia todos os demais países ali perto. E que Botsuana, apesar de ser um país bastante pobre, naquele momento tinha se descoberto, começou a caça aos diamantes. E que a capital de Botsuana é muito perto da fronteira da África do Sul, e ali se podia sentir os tentáculos do apartheid, por assim dizer. E os pais dela começaram a se envolver com grupos de artistas, de resistência política através da arte, e se tornaram ativistas políticos contra o apartheid. Então eles criam, junto com vários outros artistas ali da região, um ensemble artístico chamado Medu, que virou realmente uma célula de resistência política e de ativismo. E que em 1985, quando ela tinha 2 anos e meio, acontece um fim abrupto daquele, e eles têm que fugir. 5 ativistas desse grupo Medu foram exterminados pela polícia do apartheid, inclusive um amigo muito próximo dos pais dela, que morava com eles na casa. Então, em mais ou menos 15 dias, eles tiveram que fugir de Botsuana e foram para Lesotho, onde ela morou até os 7 anos e meio. E ela fala que essa luta política dos pais e esse evento do assassinato desses ativistas, dos quais os pais fazem parte do grupo, foi um evento que determinou a visão de mundo dos pais e a visão de mundo dela. E transformou ela, já inseriu ela como um confronto com a história e com a política, ali nos seus primeiros dias. Stella, como que você se envolveu com o WikiLeaks? Conta pra gente.
Well, I think my first awareness of WikiLeaks must have been around 2008 or 2009, where I came across WikiLeaks publications online. It was not until 2010 that I re-encountered it with obviously the collateral murder video. I remember watching the news with the press conference where Julian was presenting. At that point, I didn't imagine that I would ever meet him or marry him, obviously. But I remember the moment of watching Julian presenting the collateral murder video and watching the video and it impacting me a lot. And then obviously in 2010, there were a lot of, I was following the news as WikiLeaks was publishing about Afghanistan and then Iraq and the diplomatic cables. It was in 2011 when I actually got the opportunity to get involved. I got involved via Jennifer Robinson, who is one of the most long-standing lawyers of WikiLeaks. She's been representing Julian since 2010, and she sent an email, and I responded to that email, and came to.
What was the email saying?
That they were looking for. I can't remember exactly.
Swedish speaking?
Not specifically, but obviously, when I showed up and said I spoke Swedish, that was, I guess, a notch in my favor. I came in February 2011. I came to London because I was in Spain at that moment. I flew to London and met Julian on a day when he was preparing for a court hearing the next day, I think. I met Julian and various other people for about 2 hours, and I was, very, very excited about getting to know these people who were changing the world.
Was it love at first sight?
I wouldn't say so.
Okay.
I was very curious to get to know people. Julian, obviously, who had been on the TV talking about these publications. The idea of WikiLeaks is so transformative, and I saw this as a game changer. And so, being able to be involved in this case was really, like, when I saw the opportunity, I thought, wow, this is really something I want to contribute to. And when I met Julian and his team and Jennifer and so on, I thought, wow, these people are very inspirational, and I'd love to be a part of this.
And you met Jen before in the university, isn't it?
We didn't actually coincide. We were both had mutual friends and so on, so that's how I got her email. But yeah, we were 1 year apart when we were in Oxford, more or less. I think she left 1 year before me.
Stella, everyone wants to know, how was life in the embassy? How was the day-to-day work? Because you follow throughout the history of the embassy.
Yes.
Now you were a local fixture.
Well, it was almost 7 years inside the embassy, and during those 7 years, a lot of things happened, and the climate inside the embassy also changed a lot. There was kind of a golden era inside the embassy. Obviously, there were the restrictions on Julian's movements and so on. There was no outside space. When we talk about an embassy, it's really a rather small apartment.
How small was it?
It was about, I think, 200 square meters. It was half a floor of a building in central London, right next to a very famous department store called Harrods. And it's right next to the Colombian embassy. They have the other half of the floor in the building. And it had about, I think there were about seven rooms. Some of them were off limits. Julian had about 2.5 rooms that he could use. The front room where the balcony was, there are images of Julian on the balcony. And then at the very back, and then there was a half an office at a different, in the side of the embassy. And I mean, there was all sorts of things that happened there. In the beginning, very beginning of Julian seeking asylum, before he had been officially given the asylum. For example, there were 3 or 4 British police officers in the middle of the night who were caught on the security cameras throwing a coin at the window where Julian was sleeping. The videotape mysteriously disappeared, but it was witnessed by at least one of the embassy diplomats who reviewed the tape and saw it. It was the security company, by the way, that controlled the videotape, and it was disappeared in their possession. So this was very early on, 2012. The embassy was very accommodating in the beginning. I think the diplomats and the people who were working there were very supportive. up until the end when they changed all the staff and the people who came in were actively hostile. But at that beginning period, there was a lot of very interesting people coming in. For example, you know, people from the entertainment industry, artists, intellectuals, constantly coming
Can you give us a few names? Stella Anderson?
Yes, Lady Gaga, Eric Cantona, but also intellectuals like Pérez Esquivel, Chomsky, yes. Ellsberg, yes, Ellsberg came. So this was kind of the golden era. Then the restrictions on Julian really started when the new government came in. Lenin Moreno's government, who was really hostile from the start. I mean, there's a report from, I think, the Wall Street Journal that even before Lenin Moreno took office, he was meeting with the US administration and offering Julian up in exchange for debt relief. So Julian was seen by the Moreno government as a pawn to extract concessions. And in the end, of course, Julian was handed over, and shortly after, Ecuador received IMF loans and so on, worth billions. And also at the time, we heard, while Julian was in the embassy, we were told that Ecuadorian officials had been at the IMF and had a meeting at the IMF, and that Julian was put on the table as a factor that was obstructing Ecuador's ability to get IMF loans. So it was clear that once Lenin Moreno was in, he was set on selling Julian in exchange for concessions. And things got really bad towards the end of the embassy. Now we know a lot of what was going on. Obviously, this was when the Trump administration had got in. Mike Pompeo was head of the CIA. There was an elaborate operation going on inside the embassy, together with the security company that had been secretly working with the CIA and was recording the meetings with Julian was having with his lawyers, physically transporting those hard drives to the United States. There were instructions to get the DNA of our baby who was coming in at the time. It was 6 months old, by stealing a nappy from the embassy when our son was coming to see his father. So all of these things were occurring while Ecuador was, prepared to give concessions, and basically the CIA became very aggressive during this time. There were plans to kidnap and even assassinate Julian, but it was never, up until the end, Ecuador was slightly uneven. So, for example, the foreign minister, Maria Fernanda Espinosa, tried to find a way for Julian to leave the embassy. And this was still during the Moreno government, and was actively trying. So, for example, Julian was given Ecuadorian citizenship. He had already spent 5 years there, so he was eligible. And then he was given a diplomatic posting. And that was thanks to her decisions. And there was a genuine attempt by part of the Ecuadorian government to resolve the issue. But then on the other hand, you had the president, Lenin Moreno, was working in a different direction. And these assassination plans came right after this decision to give him diplomatic status. There were plans to kidnap him, and ultimately the CIA plans to imprison him worked, because it all came together on the 11th of April, 2019.
There was some point that you stopped going to the embassy. Were you afraid? What happened there?
Yes, I was afraid. I was mostly afraid for Julian. Towards the end, the final few months, things were so difficult inside the embassy, and so hostile and so unpredictable that I thought anything could happen in there. It had become like a black site. You know, if something happens to you inside an embassy, and the government and the embassy is not willing to just turn a blind eye and let it pass, then anything can happen inside an embassy. And in fact, there are cases where people have been killed inside embassies. Of course, we know of the Khashoggi case, but there are many others. There was a case of, I think, a Palestinian in, I can't remember what country. Anyway, I think there's a whole history of very shady things that have happened to people in embassies where nothing has happened afterwards. And I think Julian was in this position where he could easily have been murdered, except I think too many eyes were on the embassy. So, but I thought that was within the realm of possibility. And when towards the end of Julian being in the embassy, I was pregnant with our second child, and I stopped going to the embassy, in part because of this extremely intimidating environment inside the embassy. I was also hiding the fact that I was pregnant because I didn't know how the Ecuadorian government might seize this in order to get an excuse to throw Julian out. I mean, that's how uncertain it was. So when I was 6 months pregnant, Julian and I decided actually this is best not to continue coming in for the time being. I was also extremely stressed, and obviously this was having health effects as well. But I think my greatest fear was that something would happen to Julian, but also, you know, I was being followed and this kind of thing. And I thought, actually, that targeting me would be a very effective way of targeting Julian. And so the fact of trying to get the DNA from our eldest child was clearly something that could be used in that way. You know, why would you want to confirm the paternity of a baby coming in? Obviously, so it can be leveraged somehow. And so, you know, I think none of us were safe. None of us. The fact that we weren't physically attacked at the time, that was just, it didn't happen, but it could perfectly have happened.
Okay, of course. You had a secret relationship in the embassy with Julian for a long, long time. Many two them together. Many people did not know anything about it, even closest to you. Your name, you changed your name from Sarah Devant to Stella Assange. Then, and you only came public and became this amazing campaigner because the judge, paradoxically, the judge here in the UK forced you to. She wanted to reveal your identity that you so carefully wanted to conceal. I want to know why this decision to be completely anonymous when you had so much to say.
Well, even when I started getting involved, I was fully aware that this was a dangerous situation for Julian, obviously. But there was a campaign to intimidate anyone around Julian by saying really extreme things. So on US cable television, they were talking about assassinating him, breaking the law to get rid of him, treating him like an enemy combatant, and anyone involved with him. Jennifer Robinson also received a letter crossing boundaries, treating her like, addressing her as if she was not his counsel, but just extending the net of intimidation around Julian. And this was the moment in which I first came into contact with Julian and WikiLeaks, and it was clear that that a very robust legal defense was needed. But I also was aware that exposing myself to this was not necessarily in my not necessarily something I was willing to do, because it's intimidating, right? And I was just entering into contact with this, and I wanted to protect my family, my parents, and so on. So very early on, it was clear to me that I just wanted to help to work on this case, but to keep a very low profile. And obviously, as time went by, I became more and more involved in Central, obviously, to Julian. But I think part of the way of protecting Julian was by keeping a low profile. I know that the security company was extremely determined to try to find out more about me, and they couldn't, because I let so little be known. And in fact, when I started at working with Jennifer Robinson and the defense, I had a public profile, and that was why I wanted to. I mean, not a huge one, but as someone who had been published some papers and done this and that, it would be easy for people to find out more about me. Let's say it that way, and I didn't want that.
Oh, sorry, such a nice name. What did you change it? Stella is a well beautiful too. Go ahead.
So I think precisely because of this mapping out Julian's surroundings was harder if I kept a low profile. And of course, afterwards, after I became public, then the kind of thing that I wanted to protect, for example, protect my parents and this kind of thing, well, they've become, well, let's just say that there are always trolls out there who are willing to target people around in the surroundings. But so that's the reason why. And also I wanted to protect, well, Julian and our children eventually, because it was a clear vulnerability, like it's an attack vector, right? To target family. That's a well-known intimidation technique. And I think that staying as far as I could be anonymous made it more difficult. And
were your parents supportive from the beginning? Were they scared? Get your fingers out of this. Are you crazy? Did they know anything? How was it with your parents?
Well, I think my parents were proud. They are, they have their own history in fighting injustice, and I don't think they were surprised. And they also met Julian and admire him when he was still in the embassy. They met with. They came over for dinner and met Julian, so on. Had Christmas dinner with them as well.
Where did you tell them we are a couple?
Yeah, I can't remember, but it was, you know.
Maybe you didn't tell, you just presented. Muitas pessoas perguntam pra gente como que o Julian tá mentalmente, fisicamente, e como que é. Com que frequência ela pode visitá-lo, as crianças também, vê-lo e estar em contato.
Well, Belmarsh prison is a high security prison. It's notorious here in the UK. They call it Britain's Guantanamo. And it's where he has been since the day of his arrest. So he has been there for 4 months and something like 3 months. He just spent his 5th birthday. Sorry, no, his 5th birthday is coming up in Belmarsh prison because a couple of months after he was arrested, it was his birthday, and he was turning 48, I think. 47 it must have been. And he's turning 52 on the 3rd of July. So it's a very difficult existence for him because he's in a single cell for more than 20 hours a day, 22 hours a day usually.
What does he do with his time?
Well, he reads, he walks inside his cell, which is about 3 meters long, up and down. He calls me, he calls his lawyers. He has a short list of people he can call. The prison has a window of about 1 hour a day where he is able to go to the yard to be outdoors, but sometimes that doesn't happen. And then once or twice a week, I'm able to visit him.
And can he socialize with other inmates?
Well, during the COVID period, he was extremely isolated and there was no socialization allowed, but depending on the day, he can, yes, he can socialize with some people within his section of the prison.
And how is his mental state and his physical state? What can you say about it?
Well, the physical state obviously is getting worse and worse because that's what happens in a prison. You keep a person inside a cell, you don't let them out, you limit their social and physical existence to a cell for years. Obviously, it shortens your life and it turns your health into
no self-determination, right?
Well, it's you can see it with animals, you can see it with people. It's just and considering that Julian isn't even convicted of anything, he's just being kept there indefinitely for years and years in an extremely difficult environment, is having a terrible effect on his health. So Julian had a mini stroke in October 2021. He's on medication now for that, but he shouldn't be experiencing this kind of health deterioration. When I met Julian, he was a person who was in physical health, physically active, and now he's confined and suffering from complications to his health. And mentally, well, he's extremely resilient and strong, but also obviously feeling the effects of this kind of isolation. And just a couple of weeks ago, a good friend of his, Daniel Ellsberg, died. During these 4 years, he's had news of people close to him who he hasn't been able to see, who have passed away. And these kinds of things obviously affect him, and not to speak about the prospect of life imprisonment in the United States, away from me and the children, in extreme isolation. I mean, to such an extent that the kind of restrictions I'm talking about in Belmarsh do not compare to what the United States would be putting him through. No contact with other people, no contact with the outside world, a phone call maybe once a month, exercise in a small space of as big as a cage, as big as a parking place, in the middle of the night, this kind of thing.
Do you see any relationship between Lula's case and Julian's case, and what can we expect from the British courts?
Well, clearly, the case that was taken against Lula was a political case. It was lawfare. It was another instance of lawfare. It's very interesting. Even before the whole Lava Jato case was revealed, it was quite extraordinary how much Judge Moro was bigged up in the U.S. media. Suddenly they were talking about this judge. How was he a judge or a prosecutor?
He was both.
Okay. Yes, I couldn't quite remember.
Yeah, because he was both.
I remember reading about the man who was instrumental in the case against Lula and how he was being elevated in the U.S. press, and I thought this is quite extraordinary. And of course, it's par for the course when we saw what happened, what was revealed about how involved the U.S. was. We know in Julian's case that as early as July 2010, before the first arrest warrant was issued by Sweden, before Julian had even gone to Sweden, a whole week or 10 days before Julian left for Sweden, the United States State Department was contacting its closest allies in Europe and saying, find a way to stop this guy, find a way to bring a case against him. At the time, of course, the United States knew that Julian and WikiLeaks were going to publish about Iraq, were going to publish about the State Department, and the United States was desperately trying to prevent this from happening. Of course, WikiLeaks at the time had made partnerships with other publications. Daniel Ellsberg had a backup copy, so even if something had happened to Julian, the publications would continue. But the US State Department, of course, was indicating to its allies to use the criminal justice system as a way to further its political goals, in this case to silence Julian. And this is what we've seen eventually over the past, since 2010, that the attack on Julian has been on many different fronts. Political attacks on his person, financial, banking blockade on WikiLeaks and on Julian specifically, and of course legal as well. And that the case that has been brought against Julian is a front through which the United States has used and abused the legal system, the criminal justice system, in order to imprison him and try to silence him.
When Lula was about to be arrested, he conveyed a huge amount of supporters in the union, and he said, I'm giving myself to prison because they cannot imprison me. I am an idea. I'm the heart of each of them. And so is Julian. And I often say that to my public, whilst the persecution of Lula was authoritarian, I find the persecution of Julian Assange totalitarian. It's another scale. I don't know if you agree with that. Eu conto para ela que quando o Lula foi se entregar à prisão, ele falou, eles não podem me prender, porque eu sou uma ideia no coração das pessoas. E acho que é a mesma coisa. O Assange revolucionou, ele quebrou o monopólio interpretativo da grande mídia e mudou a maneira de fazer o jornalismo, envergonhou a grande mídia. E eu quero justamente falar com a Stella a respeito da grande mídia, porque a gente sabe que o Lula agora em Roma falou que os jornalistas são covardes. Ele chamou os jornalistas de covarde por não defenderem o Assange. E E eu pergunto para ela se eles são só covardes ou se eles são cúmplices.
Well, there's not one press, but there is certainly cowardly press and elements within that press that are happy to be used as accomplices in targeting political enemies. And there's no doubt that this has happened in Julian's case. I think the fact that the press isn't loud enough nowadays is cowardice. I think the President Lula is absolutely right to call them out. Unfortunately, there's too much of a perhaps a confusion of roles within the press. The press is supposed to keep a check on power, but for a series of reasons, perhaps people need the security of the paycheck, perhaps they're power hungry, they all too often fail in that role. That doesn't mean that that there aren't good journalists who try to still fulfill their role, sometimes within institutions, although I think that's getting harder and harder. But there's also a very, I think, vibrant alternative media. I mean,
can you give us some name?
Well, I think I follow the English-speaking media. I follow Matt Taibbi. I follow Glenn Greenwald. I follow a number of others that I think are obviously the ones who are writing about Julian's case, Kevin Costello and so on. But this is extremely important to have other voices, and increasingly you see very experienced veteran journalists, investigative journalists, who decide that actually they want to speak directly to their audience. And it's very positive that the audience is responding to that and showing, basically voting with their feet. And you see how the legacy media becomes more and more beholden to advertisers and official power, because the readership is no longer the audience for them. You see this very clearly in the U.S. Television landscape, for example, where you wonder, well, who are they actually speaking to? Because it doesn't really resonate with the audience. Their audience numbers are falling dramatically, and even their most televised, their most attractive presenters are terminated. So it's a very
social media coming in as well, right?
Social media. So I think the press landscape is very interesting, but there is certainly it's certainly clear that Julian's prosecution is bad for everyone. I mean, even for the press that is very close to power, they should seek to preserve their independence when they want to exercise it. And Julian's case will prevent even that. So I think quite recently, we've seen a more robust position from the editorial lines, the New York Times, the Guardian, and so on, saying the case should be dropped, should have come 4 years ago, or even 10 years ago. If they had played their role properly, then Julian would never have been in prison in the first place, or in the embassy, or any of that. But in order to stop this extradition, if there were a concerted effort by the press, of course, the United States administration would never dare to do what they're doing. And so this is an epic failure by the press to actually not just defend one of their own, but to be able to stand up for their own interests.
So we had Lula and 5 other presidents declaring Julian Assange a political prisoner. It means it's not a matter for the British courts. It's our problem. He is a political prisoner, and we are against the extradition. And Lula also came in the day of the coronation and talked about Assange being a political prisoner. How can leaders of the world? This is a case that we cannot rely on the justice system. The justice system is definitely a setup. It's the mechanism, it's the system to the method. It's a political prosecution. We need to attack this how political leaders like Lula can help to save Julian Assange and stop this persecution. Talk to them.
Well, I'd like to personally thank from the bottom of my heart President Lula for bringing Julian up repeatedly and for supporting him for so long. Not just recently, but he is, I think, understood even before he experienced the same thing himself, that Julian is a geopolitical prisoner, that Julian tried to and succeeded in actually bringing to light the criminality and corruption that was being committed against the peoples of Iraq and Afghanistan, but also the violation of long-standing principles and agreements, for example, in relation to Brazil, as you brought up. And this is crucial because we've witnessed over the many years that Julian has been persecuted and made to suffer, that the legal system has failed in withstanding political pressure, and that in a situation such as this, in such an enormously cruel case such as this, it necessitates people of Lula's standing, not just in terms of Lula's political clout, but also moral standing, to speak out. Because the attack on Julian is really a departure from a world in which democratic ideals have been upheld to a new world in which they are held in contempt. And of course, this means we are in a global community in which, if those long-standing principles of human rights, of democracy, of openness, are not respected and are in fact scorned, then the whole edifice falls apart. Julian's case is about Julian. It's about our family being separated. It's about Julian's survival, but it's also about bigger principles that Julian and WikiLeaks embodied boldly, protected activities of journalism, of the right to truth, of holding governments that were committing crimes, war crimes, covering them up, holding them to account. And if Julian is allowed to continue to suffer and remain imprisoned, then all these ideals that we've fought so hard for so long, and which were have long been a principled ideal of the kind of world we want to live in, all that falls apart. So I'm extremely grateful to Lula, because when he speaks, everyone listens. The press listens. When he calls them cowards, you can be sure that they are listening, and they need to hear it. They need to hear it to their face. And of course, Lula is a global leader. There's no question about that, and it is that kind of leadership that that changes the course and the direction and makes a new political reality possible. So I think lots of people around the world, lots of governments and the press are listening very intently to what Lula is saying.
Stella, anything to add?
Thank you for having me.
I thank you. I'm thrilled to have you. Thank you so much. And the fight continues. As long as Assange is being politically persecuted, there is a fight for everyone to do. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks.